Mark Prior confessed. Not in a press release. Not through a carefully worded statement from the Dodgers PR team. He confessed standing in front of reporters, his voice quiet, his eyes low, the way a man speaks when the weight of something he's been carrying alone finally becomes too heavy to hold. I hid the extent of Shohei's injury. The room went still. Not the kind of still that happens when someone says something surprising. The kind of still that happens when something that everyone quietly feared is suddenly spoken out loud. When the thing that lived in the back of every Dodgers fan's mind, that nagging, uncomfortable thought they kept pushing aside every time Ohtani took the mound, stepped forward and introduced itself by name. This wasn't a rumor anymore. This wasn't speculation from beat reporters or whispers from anonymous sources. This was the Dodgers' own pitching coach. The man who stood 30 feet from Ohtani on that mound in the 5th inning. The man who put his hand on Ohtani's shoulder and told him to breathe. That man had just told the world that what they saw wasn't the whole picture. And before anyone could fully process those words, the Dodgers GM walked to the podium and made it worse. 4 players. Removed from the rotation. Effective immediately. Shohei Ohtani's name was first on the list. It started the way most bad news starts in professional sports. Quietly. An emergency meeting. Closed doors. The kind of stillness around a front office that reporters learn to read like a change in weather. By the time the Dodgers GM stood in front of the microphone, the room was already tense. There were no smiles. No prepared jokes to lighten the mood before the cameras rolled. He placed both hands flat on the podium, looked directly into the cameras, and said the words that nobody in Dodger Stadium, nobody watching from home, nobody who had spent the last month watching Ohtani rediscover himself as a pitcher wanted to hear. Shohei Ohtani would not take the mound again this season. Neither would 3 others. He didn't speak long. He didn't explain much. He said the organization had become aware of information regarding the physical condition of several players. He said the decision was made in the best long-term interest of those players and of the franchise. He said more details would follow as the medical evaluations were completed. And then he stepped away from the microphone before the first question could be asked. It was the kind of press conference that creates more silence than sound. Because what wasn't said filled the room louder than what was. The questions that followed didn't go to the GM. They went to Mark Prior. Prior had been in baseball long enough to understand the difference between a difficult moment and a defining one. He had been a pitcher himself. He knew what it meant to stand on a mound with something wrong in your arm and tell yourself it was manageable. He knew that feeling. The one where you convince yourself the pain is just discomfort. That discomfort is just effort. That effort is just what greatness costs. He sat down in front of the reporters with no notes. No prepared statement. Just his hands folded in front of him and the expression of a man who had already made peace with what he was about to say. The reporter's first question was simple. Direct. Almost gentle, given the circumstances. Did you know how serious Ohtani's injury was before his last start? Prior didn't look away. He didn't reach for water. He didn't ask for the question to be repeated. He nodded once. Slowly. Yes. I knew. Another silence. Longer this time. And I made a judgment call that I shouldn't have made alone. The extent of what Shohei was dealing with, I kept that closer than I should have. That's on me. That decision was mine, and I was wrong. He didn't dress it up. He didn't hide it inside a longer answer about competitive pressures or medical protocols or the complicated reality of managing a superstar in a pennant race. He said it plainly. He had hidden the extent of the injury. He had known. And he had let Ohtani take that mound anyway. The reporter asked the follow-up that everyone was thinking. Did Ohtani know? Prior paused. It was the first time he paused. Shohei always knows his body better than anyone. What he chose to do with that knowledge, that was his decision. What I chose to do with mine, that was a mistake I have to live with. There are moments in sports that don't happen on the field. Moments that happen in hallways. In closed offices. In the kind of quiet corners of a stadium that cameras never reach. Moments that shape what happens next more than any game ever could. Shohei Ohtani walked to Dave Roberts' office. Not with a translator. Not with an agent. Not with anyone who might soften the conversation or redirect it toward something more comfortable. He walked there the way he does everything, without drama on the outside, and no one quite knowing what was happening on the inside. Roberts was already there. Word had reached him before Ohtani knocked. In a situation like this, it always does. He knew what the conversation was going to be about. He knew what Ohtani was feeling, or at least he thought he did. But when Ohtani sat down, what he said first wasn't anger. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect from a player who had just learned that the people around him had made decisions about his body without his full knowledge. He asked one question. "Did you know?" Roberts looked at him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable the way silences between strangers are. It was the silence between two people who have spent a season building something together, and who both understand that what is said next will either hold that thing together or begin to take it apart. Roberts answered him honestly. And whatever that answer was, whatever passed between them in that office with no cameras and no reporters and no one to shape the narrative afterward, it mattered. Because when Ohtani walked out of that office, he walked out differently than he walked in. Not lighter. Not heavier. Different. Like a man who had asked the question he needed to ask, and received the answer he was going to have to figure out what to do with. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to understand what the last month meant. When Ohtani stepped onto that mound against the Padres, it wasn't just a return from a brief rest. For the people who had watched the Dodgers navigate the delicate, complicated reality of having the most complete baseball player alive on their roster, a man who pitches and hits at a level that doesn't fit inside the existing vocabulary of the sport, that start meant something beyond the box score. It meant he was back. It meant the shoulder was fine. It meant the arm was fine. It meant that the version of Ohtani that had made the entire baseball world stop and stare last October was not a memory but a promise about what was still to come. The home run on the first pitch. The 5 scoreless innings. The bases-loaded moment in the 5th when he reached back for something and found that sweeper and got that double play and roared on the mound with the kind of emotion that doesn't come from comfort, it comes from relief. Now, looking back at that moment through the lens of what Pryor confessed, everything looks slightly different. That roar on the mound. That fist pump. That moment where the Dodgers pitching coach visited for 30 seconds and told the greatest baseball player on earth to just breathe. What exactly was he breathing through? How much of that performance was Shohei Ohtani at full capacity? And how much of it was Shohei Ohtani at something far less than that, refusing to let the scoreboard know? The Dodgers now face a season that looks fundamentally different than it did 48 hours ago. 3 other players removed alongside Ohtani. Names that matter in that clubhouse. Names that were woven into the game plan for October. The GM's press conference didn't include timelines. It didn't include diagnoses. It offered almost nothing except the fact of it, the blunt, uncomfortable, season-altering fact. The bullpen that finished off the Padres so cleanly, the defense that didn't crack, the lineup that absorbed everything San Diego threw at them, all of that remains. But the foundation that Roberts had been quietly building toward October, the game plan that required Ohtani to be available in the way he was available against the Padres, that game plan is being rewritten tonight. And somewhere in this city, in a stadium that was full of noise 48 hours ago, Dave Roberts is sitting with that rewrite in front of him. Thinking through what he has. What he doesn't. What he believed he had, and what turned out to be something more complicated. Mark Pryor is somewhere too. Living with a confession that no one forced him to make but that he made anyway. Because at a certain point, carrying something alone stops being protection and starts being its own kind of damage. And Shohei Ohtani, the man who hit a home run on the first pitch of his first start in a month and then pitched 5 innings on something he may not have fully disclosed to the people around him, is somewhere in this city deciding what the rest of his season looks like. Not the season he planned. Not the season the Dodgers built around him. The season that's left. After Pryor's confession, one reporter asked him what he would say to Ohtani if he could say anything. Pryor didn't answer right away. He looked at the table. He straightened the papers in front of him that didn't need straightening. And then he looked up. I'd tell him that what he did out there was real. Whatever was happening physically, what he did on that mound, what he did in that batter's box, no one manufactured that. That was him. He paused once more. I just should have protected him better. The room didn't erupt. No one shouted a follow-up. The cameras kept rolling. The silence held itself for a moment the way silence sometimes does when something true has been said and there's nothing left to add to it. There are rules in baseball about rosters and rotations and what a team is allowed to ask of its players. There are rules about medical disclosures and pitcher limits and how many days of rest a two-way superstar requires between starts. None of those rules cover this. None of them tell you what to do when the most extraordinary player in the sport has been carrying something invisible, and the people around him let him carry it, and the scoreboard said 4-0, and the stadium was loud, and for 5 innings on a May night it looked like everything was fine. It wasn't fine. And now everyone knows.